Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Network Seminar Series hosted by the Center for Networked Intelligence at the ECE and RBCCPS IISc. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Bharadwaj Satchidanandan. He will be speaking on incentive compatibility in two-stage repeated stochastic games. Professor Bharadwaj is an assistant professor of electrical engineering at Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. Before this, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the Laboratory of Information and Decision Systems at MIT, where he was hosted by Professor Communications, Control, Networks, etc. Over to you, Professor.
All right, so it's sort of a pleasure to be here. So thanks for the kind invitation to sort of present a talk in this CNI seminar series. I just sort of had a look at the list of past speakers in CNI, and I was a little intimidated by some of the names that featured in that. So it's indeed a real pleasure and honor to be able to talk in this CNI seminar series. So particular thanks to all the organizers for having invited me to talk in this seminar. All right, so today I'm going to talk on this topic, which is incentive compatibility in two-stage repeated stochastic games, and almost all that, everything that I'm going to talk about is joint work with this extremely incredibly handsome gentleman, Professor Muntar Dale, who was my postdoc advisor at MIT. All right, so just to sort of give a background, so this two-stage repeated stochastic games is basically sort of a game theoretic framework, or a sort of a theoretical abstraction that allows us to model many problems or many emerging issues in next generation power systems. And so by sort of in some sense abstracting the key features of these problems that arise in next generation power systems and sort of studying this abstract theoretical framework, the hope is that we will be able to develop insights that can be applied to a variety of problems that arise in next generation power systems. So I will also, of course, very concretely motivate this framework of two-stage repeated stochastic games, but this is just sort of by way of introduction. Okay, so sort of the background for all of this is that the power system as we know it today is unsustainable in the long run, and so we are sort of burning a lot of coal and fossil fuels, which is emitting a lot of greenhouse gases. That's bad for the environment, global warming, blah blah blah. And so we need to transition to a more sustainable way of producing and consuming power. Okay, so today's power system is actually characterized by three features. The first is that the demand is something that's random. Okay, so I can decide to turn on and turn off my air conditioner at any time, and so essentially the demand is something that sort of very arbitrarily varies. Okay, and the second feature is that a bulk of the power that is produced today comes from fossil fuels, or it's basically fossil fuel generators, which, as we all know, emits a lot of greenhouse gases, and we want to move away from that. And sort of the third feature of today's power grid, which we also expect to extend into the foreseeable future, is that there is little to no storage. Okay, there is virtually no storage capacity in the power system. So of course, you have batteries and so on, right? Which they can store energy, but then batteries, you can store energy in very small quantities. Okay, but then when it comes to storing energy in utility scale quantities, batteries are still extremely expensive at current technology. Of course, our colleagues in chemical engineering and chemistry are working very hard to make batteries cheaper and make utility scale batteries economically viable. But so far we are at a stage where they are economically unfeasible, unviable, and so we are stuck with sort of the assumption that we have virtually no storage in a power system. So this is actually sort of a very strong constraint. Okay, so the fact that you don't have storage in a power grid, what that implies is that any power that is generated has to immediately be consumed. Okay, so you don't have storage, and so this is basically an instant-wise balance of demand and supply. Okay, so how on earth are we going to be able to manage instant-wise balance of demand and supply? That's using a combination of feed-forward and feedback control. Okay. So what I mean by feed-forward control is that you have some estimate of what the demand is going to be at some future time, and then you plan so that you generate to meet that demand. Okay. So that's what feed-forward means. So you have some forward estimate of what the demand is going to be, and then you plan ahead so that you're able to meet that demand. And feedback control essentially does something in sort of reactive to what's happening. Okay. So you essentially in real time you measure what the demand supply mismatch is. For example, you can measure the frequency of the grid. Okay. So the nominal frequency in India at least is sort of 50 hertz. In certain other countries it's 60 hertz. So sort of broadly speaking, the nominal frequency in a power system could be either 50 or 60 hertz depending on the geographical location. And if the frequency of the grid is above the nominal frequency, then that's an indication that there is more supply or there is more generation than demand. Okay, and so what that implies is that you better sort of reduce your generation. So on the flip side, if the frequency of the grid is lesser than the nominal frequency, for example, if instead of 50 hertz it's 49.8 hertz, then that's an indication that you don't have enough generation. And so that is an indication that you have to ramp up your generation. Okay, and then in your control systems you have automatic control systems, like for example the automatic generation controller, the governor system, and so on, which sort of do this feedback in real time. Okay, so they continuously measure what the system frequency is, and then they automatically sort of fire up and turn down generators in real time. Okay, so these are sort of the two typical methods combination by which you attain instant-wise demand-supply match. And for the bulk of this talk,
so isn't feed forward is in a sense predicting the future, right?
That's right.
And you're achieving feed forward by feedback. Is there any other way to achieve it?
You don't achieve feed forward by feedback. So these are two different ways of control, two different paradigms of control. Okay, so feed forward is, suppose I estimate that tomorrow is going to be very hot. Okay, and so people are going to in some sense turn on their air conditioners. Then I will predictively schedule my generators so that I sort of produce enough energy and so on.
But don't you estimate using feedback?
You don't estimate using feedback. So feedback is something like, so you always have some estimation errors. Okay, so you have this feed forward or prediction of how much energy is going to be consumed, let's say some X time units into the future. Now that could always in real time you could always, I mean, if I just switch on a fan, there is no way anything could predict that, right? So feedback is used to sort of trim those minor unpredictable variations in demand. Okay, so any other question?
If you take generators, they usually take some time to switch on and off. So how can you deal this in real time? Like if you have some feedback and you have like, okay, frequencies like 49.8, and how can you switch off and you are able to balance this power in real time? Okay,
so that's an excellent question. So this is precisely the reason. So basically these generators have dynamic constraints or ramping constraints. Okay, you cannot quickly turn on and turn off a generator as in when you like. For example, if you look at a nuclear power plant, it wants to sort of output a very constant power. It doesn't like to be disturbed too much. So this is the reason why feed-forward control actually happens at multiple time scales. Okay, so in order to respect these ramping constraints and dynamic constraints of these generators, that's exactly where sort of I'm coming next. Okay, so I'll answer that question in a while, but before that, so if this question does not get answered in the next 15-20 minutes, ask again. So any other question? All right. So this is basically, so this talk is going to mostly, be on feed-forward control. Okay, and how do you do feed-forward control via markets? Okay, so that's going to be the theme of this talk, and we are not going to actually worry about feedback control at all. We just assume that there is going to be some feedback control system in the grid which is sort of doing this, fine-tuned, or these small variations are going to be compensated by that. So we are just going to be worried about this feed-forward control for the rest of this talk. All right, so one day before power delivery, for reasons that you sort of alluded to, there is a system operator that's going to estimate what the demand is. Okay, so this could be, for example, based on the weather. It could be based on God knows what. Okay, so these days, I mean, there's like thousands and thousands of theses, PhD theses that have been written on load prediction. Okay, and I mean, you could have a neural network and what have you, and you could just sort of throw all data you have into this predictive model. That gives you some prediction of how much power is going to be consumed the next day. Okay, so one day before power delivery, the system operator is going to have an estimate of what the demand is. Okay, so this is typically called the day ahead estimate of what the demand is. And there are many generators throughout the country that can actually produce power to satisfy this demand, right? For example, I tried actually before this talk searching how many generators there are in India, and I couldn't get an answer for that. In the US, there are like thousands to tens of thousands of generators all over the US to actually produce power. So there are like n number of different generators that you can use to satisfy this demand. And so to satisfy the demand in an economically viable manner, what the system operator does is that it's going to make these generators compete in a market. Okay, so you run what's called a day ahead market. And wherein in the day ahead market, the sort of the generator, the system operator is going to ask these generators to bid their supply curves. Okay, supply curve is a sort of a graph of price versus quantity that can be produced at that price. So it's a monotonically increasing function. Okay, the more you pay the generator, the more power it can produce. Okay, so it's a supply curve. And so once all of these, I mean, if you don't have a lot of competition, then these generators could actually, exert market power and, overbid, their supply curves. And so to sort of, make these generators, in order to sort of produce power in an economically viable manner or an efficient manner, you sort of, make these generators compete by asking them to bid their supply curves. And then what the system operator does is that it's going to solve an economic dispatch problem, which is basically an optimization problem that determines which generators I will buy from. Okay, if a generator is too expensive, then the optimization problem will sort of suggest not to buy from that generator. And so you solve an economic dispatch problem to determine how much power to buy from each generator to satisfy the estimated demand at minimum cost. Okay, so it's basically some sort of an optimization problem, not necessarily convex and so on. Again, I mean, there have been like hundreds of PhD theses that have been dedicated to solving these economic dispatch or optimal power flow problems, at sort of an optimal at an optimal manner. All right, so the reason why you have this thing operating one day ahead is precisely for the reason that you mentioned, right? So why is it that we have to schedule these, or why should we determine the amount of power to be procured from each generator one day in advance? Okay, why can't you just do it 10 minutes in advance? The reason is that these generators have ramping constraints, and then it might take them up to a day for them to sort of slowly come ramp up. And sort of feed in at the power levels that they're supposed to feed into. All right, and then of course a few minutes before power delivery, the system operator will have a more accurate estimate of what the demand is. Okay, the day ahead estimate need not necessarily be accurate. There are going to be estimation errors. And so you sort of run a real-time market to compensate for the residual demand. Okay, and this is hopefully a smaller quantity. If your day ahead estimates are sort of anywhere half decent, then these residual demand is going to be a significantly smaller quantity, and these residual demand you procure from these from what's called a real-time market. Okay, so I call it it's real-time in quotes because it's not exactly real-time the way we understand it. Okay, so these real-time markets also actually operate maybe a few minutes before the time of power delivery. For example, in the state of California, I understand this real-time market kind of operates about half an hour before the time of power delivery. So it's not exactly real time. Okay, it's just that about a few minutes before the time of power delivery, you have better estimates of what the demand is going to be. And so again, I mean, so here you need generators to ramp up really quickly. Okay, and for that you have these diesel generators, okay, which have very high ramping rates. But then the downside is that they are extremely expensive and they emit a lot of greenhouse gases, okay, which is the reason why you don't buy everything from these diesel generators. Okay, so you use efficient generators when you can, and you use diesel generators only to sort of trim the final estimation errors. So yeah, so again in the real-time market you could have many of these diesel generators, and then again you make them compete in the real-time market and you sort of solve an optimization problem to figure out which generators to buy this residual power from. Okay, so this is sort of the way the electricity markets operate today. Okay, so any question about anything that I've said in this slide? Yeah.
Does it matter where this supply is provided? Do you have to keep geographical constraints into account?
That's true. So there is a network, okay, there is an underlying network with transmission lines, and these lines could have capacity constraints, right? And so it is sort of, that's what this optimal power flow problem is, okay? So what the optimal power flow problem does is that it's basically a constrained optimization problem. The objective is minimize the total cost, and constraints is that the transmission line capacity constraints and then the generation sort of the nameplate capacity constraints. Okay, you could have certain generators that may not be able to produce more than a certain capacity. Okay, so you have these capacity constraints and you have the transmission constraints. Okay, so if certain transmission line can transmit only 10 megawatts of power, then that's a constraint. So that could, for example, imply that even if there is a generator that's cheaper, but then if it's far away, then you might be forced to call on generators which are closer to you, even if they are more expensive. Okay, simply because you cannot, sort of pull power from there. Yeah. Any other question?
So the penalty for using diesel power, is it represented as a extra cost or as a constraint?
Yeah, so typically you sort of put a carbon tax on these guys, okay, and then you kind of mathematically you would model it as saying that these guys have a 10x the cost of these other generators that you call in the day-ahead market. Yeah, if these costs were the same, then you wouldn't have a day-ahead market at all, right? You can just buy everything in real time.
So does the last point, like a few minutes before power delivery, is it related to the feedback control, or is it still a feed
No,
forward?
everything is feed forward.
This
so
is feed
feedback
forward.
happens at t equals 0.
Okay.
Okay, so all of this is before that, right? So this is t minus 1 day, t minus 20 minutes. Okay, so the feedback only kicks in at t equals 0. I don't know, these things called governors and automatic I don't, yeah. So these are not batteries, okay? These are again sort of generators, and they could be, I think, diesel, or I don't know what they are fueled by, okay? But the point is that it's really very little amount of energy that can be compensated in feedback mode. Okay, you cannot really compensate like 10% or 20% of your demand in feedback. Okay. Anything else?
Is it not possible to unify all of feed forward to as a feedback control problem?
We can maybe talk about that offline, because I think this was something similar you also asked before, right? So I'm not able to exactly see why that is. So we will take more of this offline, okay? All right, yeah.
At a given locality, there is only one SO right now, right?
That's true. So as of now, we are going to assume that there is one system operator that caters to an entire power grid. Yeah. So for example, in the US, I think in India there are like 4 or 5 different, or maybe there is this Western interconnect or something, and then there are like 2-3 different geographical areas within India. And in the case of US, I think there is like 7 different system operators. So one for Texas, one for the East Coast, one for the West Coast, and then one for the Central America, and so on. Okay, so you basically sort of divide this country or any geographical region into certain pieces. I don't know how you divide that. Okay, I mean, some of this is just historical legacy reasons you divide things in a certain way. For example, in Texas, I think historically they wanted to be a separate country, okay, which is the reason why they had a separate power grid. Okay, some of these reasons may not even be technical. So there is like some geographical region, and then you have a system operator for every region.
Thank you.
All right. So that's the way the power systems operate today. So tomorrow's power systems, what our sort of ambition or hope is that there's going to be much higher amount of renewables in the generation portfolio. Okay, ideally we would like 100%, but I think the ambitions, I think in the Paris Climate Accord or something, I think people had signed for 40% of energy has to come from renewables by the year 2040. Okay, I mean 40% seems like a very small number, but that sort of indicates the scale of challenge that integrating renewables kind of poses. So in any case, we want a high amount of renewables in the generation portfolio. Today it's less than 15%, I think, okay, globally. And one of the features of renewable energy sources, which actually makes their integration extremely difficult, is that the power supply that they provide is uncertain. It could be random. Okay, so you cannot control how much sun shines. You cannot control how much wind blows. Okay, so these could be uncertain. They could be time varying. They could be random, and you don't have a very good handle on what that is. And so how do you integrate these renewable generators in the market? Okay, I mean if you want to do all of these things through a market. Okay, remember in the day ahead market you had these coal generators, okay, can actually give you a supply curve. Okay, they can tell you how much, at this price how much energy they can produce, and then if they called upon they can, deterministically give you that much of energy. But then you cannot, really sort of mandate a solar plant to provide you 10 gigawatts of power the next day, right? Because it depends on, you have a probabilistic estimate. Okay, so tomorrow is going to be sunny and so on. But then if there is a cloud cover at 1 p.m., then you sort of cannot satisfy your commitment, right? So that being the case, so you have to sort of think about. So today, if these generators sort of default on their commitments, then they have to pay a penalty. Okay, whereas with renewables, okay, it's a little. You have to rethink. How exactly you integrate these renewables into the market, and how do you compensate them, and what happens if they default. Okay, so you have to take into account the characteristic features of these renewables before you sort of create a mechanism to integrate them. So that's the first thing. So one more feature with uncontrollable generators, okay, which is what these renewable energy sources are, is that you can no longer make the supply follow the demand. Okay, so with coal and diesel generators, if the sort of the demand varies, then you can sort of make the supply also. If the demand goes up, you just burn more diesel, right, and the supply goes up. But then if you have a lot of your energy coming from renewables, you can't really do that, right? Because if the wind doesn't blow, what can you do? There's not much you can do. Okay, so in that kind of a scenario, one of the paradigms of maintaining this demand-supply balance, remember there's still no storage, right? So in that kind of a scenario, for you to maintain demand-supply balance, one of the paradigms is, instead of making the supply follow the demand, why don't you make the demand follow the supply? Okay, and the way you would do that is by actually financially incentivizing these loads to shift their power consumption during periods when there is a lot of renewable energy that's arriving. Okay, so this is called demand response, and this is going to be sort of, I'm going to talk a lot about demand response in this talk. Yes?
Couldn't generators bid 75% of the predicted output and then just not sell the rest if they are over?
Right. So, yeah. So that would actually, place, sort of these limits on renewable energy penetration. Suppose you want very deep levels of renewable penetration, okay, then sort of you're essentially like sort of throwing away, some renewable energy, right? So for environmental reasons, we don't sort of want to do that. But then, yes, there are different ways. As long as you can get from 15% to even 20%, it might be a valuable thing. But then the question is that the optimal thing to do? Right? Is sort of, in some sense, being conservative about how much you can produce, is that really the optimal thing to do? There could be better ways of doing it. That's one particular sort of way by which you can minimize your losses, but then that need not necessarily be the optimal way of doing it. All right, so that's basically what demand response is. So you sort of incentivize these loads to shift their consumption. For example, if I have a washing machine at home, okay, I don't have to really wash my clothes at 4 p.m. Okay, I don't mind sort of shifting that load to a different time, and I don't really want my room to be at 25 degrees Celsius, right? It's okay if I sweat a little bit, okay, but if I'm adequately compensated for my discomfort, then I wouldn't mind reducing my consumption. So by providing the right sort of the financial incentives, you will be able to make the demand follow the supply, okay, or the hope is that you'll be able to make the demand follow the supply, and this is precisely what demand response is. Okay, so as I said, in the real-time market, the system operator has a fairly accurate estimate of the demand-supply mismatch, and so at very short notice, it might be inexpensive and environmentally more friendly to actually curtail demand, okay, than to actually increase my production. Okay, to increase production, I have to burn diesel. Okay, it might be actually cheaper and environmentally more friendly for me to just turn off my air conditioner, and if sufficient number of people actually do that, then you can sort of in a very inexpensive way maintain demand supply balance. So that's what demand response is, and you can actually think of these demand responsive loads as virtual power producers, right? I mean, mathematically it's exactly the same. To produce x amounts of power and reduce x amounts of power is sort of mathematically identical. And so you can actually think of these demand response producers actually virtual power plants, which don't have any sort of dynamical or ramping constraints, right? So you can sort of make them go up and down very, very quickly. And so the question is, how do you integrate these virtual power plants or demand responsive loads into the market? You can just think of these as generators, right? So for all practical purposes, you can think of these guys as generators, and can you somehow make these generators also bid into the market? Yeah. Because of the discomfort. Yeah, right. So they have to be adequately compensated for that. Right? So they won't do it for free. Okay? If somebody comes and tells me, hey, why don't you just turn off your generator and for no reason, I'm not going to listen to that. But then if you tell me that I'll give you 500 rupees, if you can reduce your consumption, if you can turn off your AC for like 2 hours, I probably might be willing to do that. Okay? So all of this, there is a backdrop that you have financial incentives to do all of these things.
I'm just dreaming here. I don't have a clear idea, but we can think of there's a safe investment and a risky investment. You can think of diesel as a safe investment, and the risky one is I might not get my returns back.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. So actually, going forward, we will do exactly something of a similar nature, right? Because people's appetite for reducing consumption could be different. Right? I mean, I don't want to bet entirely that somebody is going to be able to reduce their consumption. Okay, it's possible that they have guests in their home, and they may not really want to reduce consumption and so on. So people may have different appetites for producing sort of this virtual power in some sense, and so you have to sort of be careful about how you do that. So this is not a case for completely removing diesel generators or so on. Okay, it may or may not be possible. You just want to sort of optimize or minimize the amount of power that you produce from, for example, fossil fuels. Okay, so that's going to be the goal. So it's not, I mean, it's never going to be possible to completely get rid of these fossil fuel generators and so on. All right, so again, these virtual power producers or demand responsive loads have two features which actually make their integration into the markets a challenge, and that's what I'm going to describe next. So the first challenge is what I call private costs, and the second challenge is what I call private baselines. Okay? So let me describe these one by one. So let's say that a demand reduction in real time, let's say a demand reduction of about D units is required. Okay, so in the day ahead market, you do all the planning, and then when real time hits, you realize that you're short by D units. Okay, and so you want these loads to reduce their power consumption by D units. Okay, now I have these n demand responsive loads or virtual power plants. Okay, you can think of it anyway. And they have their own costs for reducing power. Okay, so Ci of x denotes the cost that load I incurs for reducing its power consumption by x units. Okay, so for example, if it's a factory, okay, then the way they would actually reduce their consumption is by sort of closing some sort of machine or something like that, and that in turn might lead to them producing lesser output, God knows what, right? I mean, so ultimately that's going to eat into their profits. And so Ci of x, you want to think of it as the cost that that particular factory incurs for reducing its power consumption by x units. Okay, if it's, for example, a residential load or a university like this, then it's basically the discomfort that you experience for turning off your air conditioner, for example. Okay, so all of these things, we basically capture all of that with a cost function. And so the optimal or the social cost minimizing way of reducing consumption is given by this optimization problem. So I want to minimize the total cost totaled across every demand responsive load, subject to the constraint that the total power or consumption reduction is equal to D, which is what I need. Okay, so the sum of all power reductions has to be equal to D, and then I want to be able to minimize the cost. Okay, so that's a very straightforward optimization problem, which I mean, if the system operator is able to solve that problem, then that system operator can sort of request each of these agents to reduce by xi star, which is the solution to this optimization problem. Now there is a problem which prevents the system operator from actually solving this optimization problem, okay, which is that the system operator may not know these costs. Okay, these costs in general are going to be private to each of these loads. Okay, it's only a factory that may know what its cost is for reducing its consumption. Similarly, each of these loads. And so what the system operator could do is that it could ask each of these loads to bid their costs. Okay, so just like how you sort of in the day ahead market you have generators bidding their supply curves, you could ask each of these loads to bid what their cost functions are. Okay, however, there is no guarantee that each of these loads are going to bid their cost functions truthfully. Okay, I mean, I can always sort of exaggerate how much discomfort I would experience for reducing power consumption, right? And the reason I would do that is that so that I can sort of get higher payment from the system operator for reducing a certain amount of power. Okay, if I sort of exaggerate my costs, then I might be able to generate more revenue from the system operator for reducing a certain amount of consumption. So truthful bidding may not be an equilibrium. So if the system operator then solves this optimization problem depending on the reported costs, which may or may not be equal to the true costs, then the consumption reductions that result may not actually be the optimal solution to this optimization problem. Okay, because you're actually solving this with the wrong cost functions, and so that's going to deteriorate the social cost. And so we need a way or a mechanism to elicit these cost functions truthfully from each of these loads. Okay, so that's sort of the first challenge with integrating renewables. Okay, so the second challenge is what's called the problem of private and random baselines. Okay, so here the idea is that, okay, so let's say a system operator tells a particular load to reduce its consumption by, let's say, 10 kilowatt hours. Okay, how do you check whether that guy has indeed reduced their power consumption by 10 kilowatt hours? Okay, you only get to, so let's say I'm a system operator and then I tell, let's say Parimal, to reduce his power consumption by 10 kilowatt hours at 4 p.m. Okay, and then I get to observe how much he's consumed. Okay, I mean, how do I know whether that is indeed a reduction or not, right? Because he can always consume power the way he would have, and then say that had you not called me upon for demand response, I would have actually consumed more power, right? So that's what the baseline is. Okay, so the baseline is basically how much power you would have consumed had you not been called upon for demand response. Okay, and that's a counterfactual, and that forever remains unobserved. Okay, if I don't call you for demand response, I observe your baseline. Okay, if I call you for demand response, I observe your consumption, but then I don't observe your baseline. Your baseline will remain unobserved for eternity. Okay, and so you can basically never catch Parimal, right? In some sense. So how do you prove whether somebody has really reduced their power consumption or not? Okay, so inflated baselines give the perception of reduced consumption, even if in reality there is no reduction in consumption. And so you also need a way by which these baselines can be elicited in a truthful manner. And this is actually, something which has been observed in real world, right? I mean, I think in the US there was this, there is a stadium in Maryland where, I mean, there was a demand response program that was sort of implemented there. And the stadium, what happened was that even during days that there were no matches, they turned on all the floodlights. Okay, and that gave a perception of an inflated baseline. And then when they were called upon to reduce their consumption, they just sort of, did what they would, and they were able to, I mean, whatever expense they incurred by keeping these lights turned on, during nominal times, they were able to recoup all of that money and more by these rebates during demand response events. Okay, and this case actually went to the court, and then finally this stadium was charged penalty for sort of gaming these demand response programs. I think even in the state of Texas there is provision. I think the ERCOT is the sort of the system operator in the state of Texas, and they have provision for demand response, okay, but then the reason why they haven't actually implemented that is precisely because they don't have a very good way of estimating this baseline. Okay, it's not so much that of estimating. I mean, you do have statistical ways of estimating the baseline and so on, but then you can't really prove that somebody has that baseline. Okay, it's just an estimate that you have, and the guy can always sort of deny that. Okay, and it won't sort of stand up in the court of law. Any questions about this? All right. So these are the two problems. One is that I want to be able to elicit the cost functions truthfully, and the second is that I want to be able to elicit these baselines truthfully. And so the main result that we have, okay, it's an informal thing, is that whatever we propose a mechanism that guarantees that each load bidding its baseline and cost truthfully is in its own best interest. Okay, so by manipulating its baseline and manipulating its cost functions, it's not going to be able to improve its utility. Okay, so that's basically the result that we have. So by the way, I realized that it's I hadn't prepared to give all of the results and the sort of the theorem proof, everything in this talk. Okay, I think the most important piece of this talk is the problem formulation. Okay, so as long as I sort of set up the problem in a clean way, I think I would consider that a victory. Okay, so because the solution is really just any intelligent idiot would be able to sort of prove the theorem and so on. So I just want to give you the set up the problem and state the results. Okay, that's going to be my goal for this talk. Okay, there's going to be no proofs whatsoever. All right. So what's our approach to actually solving this problem? So what we do is that we are going to denote by delta I of t. Okay, we call this the type of a virtual power producer I on day t. Okay, so everything that I don't know about a load, I stuff it into this type. Okay, which is delta I of t. So if you tell me what delta I of t is, okay, you've told me what its baseline is and what its cost is. Okay, it's basically a vector that consists, the first entry is the baseline, and the second entry of this vector is basically the cost function. Okay, so that's what the type delta I of t is. So it's the type of load I on day t. Okay, so a particular load may not exactly know its type until a few minutes before a demand response event. Okay, so this is like saying that I don't exactly know what my baseline is going to be tomorrow. Okay, and I might have a probabilistic description of what my baseline is. And similarly, I don't know how much appetite I will have to reduce my power consumption tomorrow at 4 p.m. Okay, I might only have a sort of a estimate or a probabilistic description of what these things are, but I may not know them exactly. What is? DR is demand response. DI. Day ahead, yeah. Yeah. Right, so in the day ahead market, I might only know a probabilistic or a probability distribution of my type the following day. And it is only sort of a few minutes before a demand response event, which is basically in the real time market, that I will actually get to observe this random variable, which is my type. Okay, and so whatever mechanism I have, okay, or whatever sort of this market I propose, has to allow for the loads to only bid a probabilistic description of their types in the day ahead market for day ahead planning. And it is only in real time, if and when called upon for demand response, that the market should require these loads to bid their actual types. Okay, you could also think of it, for example, from the point of view of not demand response agents but renewable generators. Okay, you could think of these types as how much power they expect to produce the next day. That's going to be a random variable. And in the day ahead market, they might have some probabilistic description or a probability distribution of how much power they'll be able to produce the next day, but then it's only a few minutes before the time of power delivery that they'll actually get to know exactly how much they'll be able to produce. Okay, so you can think of these types as belonging to both demand response providers as well as to renewable generators.
These users as like customers or like firms which are bidding for users?
I mean, a utility provider is doing this, or as a human being, because I would not know how much energy I need even.
Right, so the way we think about this is it's not going to be a human being who will be interfacing with the market. You might sort of have smart devices, okay, which monitor your consumption, and then they will do the bidding on your behalf. Okay, so that's one way in which these things could actually get implemented. Or you could also have load aggregators, right? I mean, so you could have somebody who's aggregating, you know, all of, I don't know, CV Raman Road or something like that.
That's what made more sense. But
Right. Yeah. So you could have these aggregators who basically, you know, sort of, you know, act as a unified front, you know, for a bunch of different loads. So there are different ways in which these things could get implemented. But yes, it's definitely not a human being that's, you know, sort of directly bidding into the market. It's going to be algorithms which do that. Okay, you probably might give some high-level preferences saying, hey, I would like my room temperature to be between 25 and 28, but beyond that, you know, you sort of do the bidding in any way you want. Okay, and then it's the algorithm that will do that will take care of the rest. All right, so the mechanism has to allow for the loads to only bid a probabilistic description or a probability distribution of these types in the day-ahead market for day-ahead planning, and it's only in real time that they actually, you know, the loads will be required to bid their types. And so I'm going to denote by theta I the probability distribution of the type delta I. Okay, and so delta I of 1, delta I of 2, and so on, I'm going to assume that to be an IID sequence of random variables that are distributed according to theta I. Okay, so we are going to sort of, you know, this is finally come to the title of the talk. Okay, so I'm going to think of this demand response game as a two-stage repeated stochastic game. Okay, so the first stage is what's called the day-ahead market, and then I have these n players. These n players could be demand response providers, or they could be renewable energy generators. Okay, and in the day-ahead market, they only have a probability distribution of their types. Okay, so they only get to know what theta I is, and theta I is something that they have to report to the system operator for day-ahead planning. Okay, so for example, if let's say there is a renewable generator that feels like it will be able to produce a lot of power in real time, okay, then the system operator has to only produce lesser power from these coal generators, right? So for these day-ahead planning, you have to be able to report these theta i's, which are the distributions. You can lie here as well, which is why I have another notation, which is theta hat. Okay, so they are supposed to. So player I is supposed to report theta I, but then it could be strategic and it could lie the probability distribution of its type. So I'm going to denote by theta I hat whatever you know each player reports as its type distribution. And so what the social planner does, social planner is the same as the system operator. So the social planner is going to compute a first stage outcome as a function of the reported type distributions. Okay, so whatever is reported to it, based on that, it's going to make the first stage decision. So the first stage decision, for example, could be the day-ahead market decisions, right? So how much of power should I buy from each of these generators? Okay, that could be a day-ahead market decision. So once this market closes, everybody gets to observe the outcome of this market. Okay, and then in real time, each player gets to observe its type distribution or its type realization. Okay. So on day t, delta I of t is basically the type distribution, which is distributed according to theta I. Okay, so this is distributed according to theta I, not theta I hat. Okay, so that's according to the true distribution, and he gets to observe that in the real-time market. And again, in the real-time market, all of these players are supposed to report their type realizations to the system operator or the social planner. But here again, they could be strategic, they could game the system, and so I'm going to denote by delta I hat of t the actual type that is reported by player I on day t to the system operator. Okay, and so this is like, you know, a renewable. Yeah.
Theta 1 to theta n, they are actually distributions, right? And
that's right.
And they're not going to change from day to day, right?
They are not going to change from day to day.
So is that the first stage game is going to happen only one time, or is you going to assume that they're going to do it every day?
Right, so you can assume that the first stage outcome remains the same on all days.
All
okay,
days,
so it's only the second stage that's played every day. But of course, I mean, you can change this. Okay, on weekdays you could have something. Yeah, so weekdays you could have something, weekends you could have something, summers, winters, spring you could have different distributions.
By that definition, you need to sort of plan this O1 for all days.
All days, yes. So the first stage decision, essentially you could think of it as happening just once. It's a long-term sort of a thing, and then it's only the second stage that's different on different days. Okay. And then of course on the second day, you have, you know, the second stage decisions could depend on all history, okay, which is, you know, basically everything that's been reported to the social planner in the first stage and everything that's been reported to it on the second stage. Okay. So this second stage decision, for example, could be, you know, how much should you reduce your power consumption, okay, for a demand responsive load. Okay, so that's what basically this is. And of course, I mean the mechanism design problem, at the end of each day, okay, at the end of each day T, okay, you have a payment that is given to every player or every demand responsive load in sort of, you know, return for the demand response services they've provided, okay. And the goal is to sort of design this payment rule in such a way that you know, in some sense everybody's incentivized to set theta I hat to be equal to theta I and delta I hat to be equal to delta I on all days. Okay, so that's broadly speaking the mechanism design problem.
So you would sort of try to estimate your baseline from theta hat which you reported, right? And look at your delta I and then
Yeah, so one way is to sort of, yeah, so
if you over did this, right, then maybe I put you low cost that anyways you're going to. I don't know. What is the idea? I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, so I'm coming to that. So one thing is yes. So if the delta I hats, okay, don't sort of look like theta I hat, okay, I know for sure that you're lying, okay, and so I will penalize you, okay. If but then you have to sort of design these penalties. Yeah.
You talk so far, the gain seems to be having you over represent your theta hat, right? You will say that my consumption is higher than what you do, right? You will not under. What would you do under as well?
It's not actually clear, right? Because you also have to think about how right. You also have to think about how everybody else is going to behave.
Right.
Okay. So that's really, I mean, it's really a game, and the optimal thing you do depends on how you speculate everybody else to behave. Okay, so it's hard to give an unqualified answer to that question, right? So if I think everybody else is going to bid very aggressively, then I might also bid aggressively. Okay, if I think everybody else is going to sort of bid in a somewhat different way, then that will influence how I bid.
We're not able to think why would you underrepresent your consumption? Because then you're gonna your actual.
So the thing is, if you under-report your cost, right, what will happen is that you might be asked to, you have a higher propensity of being called upon for, you know, reducing your consumption, right, and so that might lead to an increase in your payment.
Also, I'm lying by looking at the consumption, right?
But I could also lie on the first day.
You're saying the baseline I might lie, but the cost.
You could lie both. Okay, I mean, I could lie my probability distribution itself. I could lie. I could say that I have a very low propensity for sort of, you know, reducing my consumption. I could do that. Okay. Yeah, I mean there are arguments both ways, right? Maybe we could take that. Yeah. So there are. I mean, I could at least imagine, you know, reasons why you would overbid and underbid. What you would actually do depends on how you think everybody else is going to bid. All right. Yeah. Yes.
And here you're saying that it can make use of all the history, whatever it has seen, to make the decision.
At the second stage.
Yeah.
That's true.
So if those are I'm not able to link those.
Yeah. So these things we assume. I mean, our model is that, you know, these things are IID, but then you could of course extend this to make it a little more complex. Okay. You could also, I mean, extend for these thetas to vary across time and so on. Okay, but this is sort of the simplest setting that you need to understand. Once you understand this setting, then everything else, I mean, you might be able to put wrappers around this and address more complicated scenarios. But this is sort of the simplest problem that's non-trivial. Yeah. What is known to player I? So player I on each day T knows the first stage outcomes, okay, and he or she also knows all the past outcomes. So on day 10, I know everything that's happened until day 9. The outcomes, the G2 stars. Okay, so the G2s are O2 of L. So notice that O1 is not a function of L, precisely because I assume it to be the same on all days. So the first stage outcome is the same, but the second stage outcome could be different on different days. And so on day T, I know everything until day T minus 1. I know all history. Okay, so actually when I report delta I hat of T, I could actually adapt my decision to everything that I've seen before, to all of my history. Okay, so there could be very complicated ways of bidding in the second stage. Okay, I could, for example, learn about everybody else's probability distributions and so on to adjust how I'm going to actually bid.
So O2 of T is what? Is the price or just the...
O2 of T is basically the second stage
Okay, first of all, it should be O2 of T, right? It's not
So
O2 of I.
it has to be T, yes.
Yeah. So second thing is that is this, so you're expecting that my supply will not change and I only want people to reduce, is that what it is? Or it will also be the spot market that I want, this is the extra money you'll have to pay if you have more consumption than what you promised in the beginning.
Exactly. So that is, the money itself could be different. So money is not a part of this.
No, so what is O2 of T?
O2 of T, for example, could just be the solution to that optimization problem that I showed you, right?
Okay,
Min
the
summation
cost.
Ci subject to summation
D.
Xi equals D. Okay, so the Ci's are different on different days because delta hats are different, and that could be O2 of T. Okay, that L should be T. Apologies for that. All right, so I'm going to actually just set up the problem and then I'm going to say what the result is and then we're going to close there. Okay, so what the ISO wants to do, or the system operator wants these players to bid their type distributions and realizations truthfully so that it can compute the social cost minimizing day ahead and real time decisions, of course. On the other hand, the player I does not care about social cost or anything like that. She only cares about what her utility is, and so her utility is going to be the payment that she receives minus the cost that she incurs for reducing her consumption, for example. Okay, and the cost she incurs is going to be a function of how much consumption reduction she faces, and that is basically a function of everything. That's basically contained inside this G2 star, for example. G1 star and G2 star will basically tell you how much you have to reduce your consumption, and delta I tells you what your cost parameters are. Okay, so it's basically how much you get paid minus the cost that you receive. This is on each day T, and then I divide that by T and then take the limit, the long run average limit. Okay, so this is my average utility in the long run. And this obviously is going to be a function of the strategy that I employ as player I, okay, and also the strategy that everybody else employs. So here, what do I mean by a strategy? So a strategy basically includes both the day ahead bidding policy, okay, in the day ahead market, how as a function of my theta I am going to construct theta I hat. Okay, so my policy is something that will tell me that. And in the real time, okay, I could have a possibly history dependent policy that tells me how I'm going to bid in the real time market on each day T. Okay, so this could depend on everything that I've seen until day T minus 1. Okay, so everything of the past. Okay, so this is what the strategy is. Of course, I mean, my utility is going to depend not just on how I bid, also on how everybody else bids, right? If somebody else is going to bid a very low cost for reducing their consumption, then I won't even be called for demand response. Okay, so it depends on how everybody else is going to bid, and that's why my utility is a function of not just my strategy but also on the strategy of everybody else, which is what makes this a game. Okay, okay. So now the only thing which is under the system operator's control is this payment function PIT. Okay, so this payment function specifies how much player I should be compensated on day T as a function of everything that was reported to it in the day ahead market and everything that was reported to it in the real time market until day T. Okay, so based on all information that it has up to day T, it can design a rule that specifies how much it has to pay every player I. Okay, and it's this sequence of functions PIT for every I and every T that is the system operator's design choice. Okay, that's the only thing that the system operator can touch. Okay, nothing else in this equation can be touched by the system operator. And so the mechanism design problem is that how do we design this payment function T?
G1 star and G2 star are designed assuming everyone is speaking the truth, right? I mean,
that's true.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So and then the payment policy will actually enforce that. Okay, so G1 star G2 star assumes for no good reason that people are going to bid truthfully, and it's the social cost optimizing decisions. And then you design this payment rule so that people are incentivized to bid truthfully. Okay, so that's sort of the when you're actually designing G1 star G2 star, you sort of make this assumption that there is a mechanism in place to incentivize people to bid truthfully. Okay, so that's basically what it is, and then how to design this payment rule so that for each player setting SI, which is their strategy, to be equal to TI. TI is notation for truthful strategy. Okay, truthful strategy is a strategy that sets theta I hat equals theta I, and delta I hat of T equals delta I of T for all days. Okay, it's actually not for all days, but sort of the number of days in which you lie has to be little o of T. Okay, so I mean you cannot really, I mean nothing in the world can ensure that you you are 100% honest, okay, but as long as you're honest with probability 1, okay, we are going to be happy with that. Almost surely honest, okay. So that's what it turns. So that's actually our definition of a truthful strategy, okay. So you're honest in the day ahead market, in the real time market. Over T days, the number of days you're dishonest is little o of T, okay. As long as that's true, I say that you're truthful. Okay, so that's basically what we've done, okay. So our statement of result is that we've designed a payment rule such that every player setting SI equals TI is sort of dominant in some sense, okay. So let me just, maybe I have about 2-3 minutes more, so I'll be a little more clear about the sense in which truthful bidding is an equilibrium, and then we will stop there.
But I think what is more interesting is what is PIT?
What is PIT? Yeah.
What is the mechanism?
Right. So you have to look at our paper for that.
Is it too complicated to?
It is actually, I mean, it's not too complicated, it's boring. Okay, so the first stage is basically a VCG payment for people who've taken mechanism design. Of course, I mean, this is a very classical, well-known sort of a mechanism. People who developed this won the Nobel Prize and so on. So the first stage you do that VCG kind of a thing, and then
The second price option, right?
it's a generalization of the second price auction. So second price auction is a very particular case of the VCG mechanism, so it's a little more general than that. And then you do some sort of second stage, you give some penalty. Okay, I have some slides for that, okay, but then I don't think I'll have the time to do that. But yeah, it's basically boring, okay, I promise you it's boring. So there's nothing, there's nothing conceptual in it. It's no. Even the first time I was doing it, I think I was extremely interested by the formulation. Then when it came to solving it, I just kept procrastinating that for weeks together. Anyway, so here is sort of the way in which truthful bidding is an equilibrium. So there is this notion called a dominant strategy equilibrium, which people who've taken game theory would know. Okay, so what dominant strategy equilibrium means is that you say that a particular strategy profile is a dominant strategy equilibrium. Let's say you have S1 up to Sn. Okay, you say it's a dominant strategy equilibrium if it is best for me to, as a player I, it is best for me. It is best for me to sort of play Si than to deviate to any other strategy Si prime, regardless of how everybody else plays. Okay, for example, if you say the truth telling is a dominant strategy equilibrium, then it's best for me to tell the truth regardless of whether others are sort of lying or telling the truth or how they play. Okay, so that's what dominant strategy equilibrium is. I don't care how everybody else plays, it's best for me to play the truth. Now you say that truth telling is a Nash equilibrium if sort of a weaker condition holds. Okay, so under the assumption that everybody else is telling the truth, it should be best for me to tell the truth than to deviate to a different strategy. Okay, so that's what it means for me to say that something is a Nash equilibrium. Okay. Now one of the reasons why Nash equilibrium sort of is I mean it's a very classical notion, but people have come to sort of not prefer it for a variety of reasons. Okay, it doesn't model real world behavior very well. One of the reasons is that it sort of requires you to make assumptions that all others are playing truthfully, and people may not actually be comfortable making that assumption. Okay, but then dominant strategy equilibrium does not require you to make that assumption at all. Okay, so even if everybody else is sort of dishonest to the core, it's best for me to sort of be truthful. So it turns out that we are not able to achieve dominant strategy equilibrium. Okay, we are not able to design a payment rule which gets us all the way to DSE, and Nash equilibrium is easily obtained, but then it's not something, I mean we don't really, it's not a very impressive sort of a result, right? Because it sort of, you want to remove the burden of speculation. You don't want people to assume that everybody else is behaving truthfully. So there's a new notion of equilibrium that we actually defined, which is called dominant strategy non-bankrupting equilibrium. Okay, so the first time I coined this term, I was very proud of myself, but then the more I say it, the more uncool it sounds. Okay, but we are kind of stuck with this naming. So what this says is that I don't sort of I don't need to assume that everybody else is truthful. Okay, they can play anything that they like, but then as long as they play in a way that their utility is not minus infinity, then it's best for me to play truthfully. Okay, so it's sort of a weaker assumption in some sense. So I mean, if I assume that everybody else is in some sense non-suicidal, right? I mean, they play in a way that their utility does not sort of go to minus infinity. Okay, that's a very weak assumption, right? I mean, so everybody, I mean, people will be comfortable making that assumption. As long as you just make that assumption, it's best for you to be truthful than to deviate to a different strategy. Okay, and the payment rule that we have essentially implements truth telling as a dominant strategy, non-bankrupting equilibrium. Okay, so again, I mean, yeah, so this is basically the payment rule. Okay, I mean, in the second stage, okay, this is the empirical distribution of your reported type. And if people are truthful, that has to be approximately equal to what you reported in your day ahead market. And so what I do is that I take this difference, okay, between the empirical distribution and what you reported in the day ahead market, and then I see whether it lies within a window of size r of t. Okay, and if it lies outside that window, I'm going to impose a penalty on you. Now this window size has to be sort of carefully chosen. Okay, if this goes to 0 too quickly, okay, then even truthful bids will actually fall outside that window infinitely often. Okay, and so even truthful bidders will end up paying a lot of penalty. So you have to be careful about how fast that goes to 0. So this window size has to sort of be at least as large as sort of ln t by t or something like that. And you need this JP of t. Okay, is basically the sequence of penalties. Okay, on day t, if this difference is larger than r of t, okay, then you have to pay an amount that's equal to JP of t. Okay, and this JP of t is the penalty sequence that has to be omega of t. It has to grow at least as fast as t, and the consequence of that is that these reported type distributions, if they are different, if the empirical distribution is different from what you reported in the day ahead market, then you would go bankrupt. Okay, so that's, or you would end up paying an infinite amount in penalty on average. Okay, and then of course, I mean, there is a way in which people can, so I get to observe all of history, right? So in some sense, there is a lot of common history or common information, common observations that are available to players, using which people could correlate their bids, okay, in sort of the second stage. And so if the players are truthful, then their sort of the empirical bids will be independent. And so there is another check which checks if this joint distribution factorizes as the product of the marginals. Okay, and so again, if this difference, which is what I call as h hat, is sort of does not fall in a small window, then again I will impose a penalty. Okay, and it turns out that these two things, along with the VCG payment rule, is sufficient to give you truth telling to be an equilibrium. Okay, so in some sense, you are penalizing people for reporting types which are different from their type distributions empirically, and then you're also penalizing people for correlating bids. Okay, this you can do even if people don't sort of collude. Okay, just the fact that there's so much of common history that's being observed will allow them to actually correlate their type or second stage bids. Okay, and so the actual second stage sort of the deltas are independent. Okay, and so you're in some sense checking if empirically also they are independent. And these two things, along with VCG, which is sort of very classical bread and butter of mechanism design, these two things are sufficient to ensure that truth telling is a dominant strategy, non-bankrupting equilibrium. So that's sort of the end. And of course, I mean, for the details, I mean, it's not a substitute for actually reading the paper. I wouldn't recommend reading the paper, but if you really have to, please go ahead and read it. But this is the main idea. Okay. All right. So thanks. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them either now or offline, or you can also email me. Okay.
Let's all thank the speaker. Thank you very much, Professor, for accepting our invitation and delivering such an interesting and an interactive talk. Are there any more questions from the audience? So in the interest of time, we request audience to take questions offline. We have refreshments at the coffee hut. Please feel free to continue your conversations there. Thank you all and have a great evening.
Thank you.